CBS News has learned retired General Anthony Zinni has resigned from his position as an envoy in the Trump administration. Zinni was working on resolving a dispute between Middle Eastern countries and Qatar. He says he resigned because he realized he would not be able to help. We're joined now by Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan to talk about all of this. Margaret, good to see you. Explain the situation with Qatar and what Anthony Zinni's brief was and why they are in conflict with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some of the other countries in the region.
Well, you're starting off with the easy stuff there. This is one of the more complicated disputes. But just to sort of start from scratch here, this is the latest four-star general to resign from the Trump administration. Anthony Zinni, who had been a commander of CENTCOM, he was a retired Marine Corps general, had agreed to come into the Trump administration at the request of former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to help settle this dispute between the Gulf country of Qatar, which is a base for U.S. operations in the region, hugely important to the U.S. military, and our ally Saudi Arabia and the surrounding other Arab states. The dispute really centers over accusations that Qatar had supported groups, in the words of Saudi Arabia, linked to terrorism. Some of that is in dispute. Obviously, Qatar refuses and denies that, saying that this is really about a political dispute over influence in the region. But the bottom line is Saudi Arabia and its allies had put a boycott, really tried to cut off Qatar economically, financially, politically from the region and isolate it. That created some real problems for the United States because these countries are both very important to the United States. And so General Zinni was asked to come in and help mediate that dispute, settle it, because really who else has the kind of diplomatic heft except for the United States to force the countries to the table. But he was also asked to help build up a so-called, Arab NATO kind of alliance to defend the region against threats from other countries like Iran. General Zinni told CBS News that he decided to resign because he just didn't see any breakthrough possible here diplomatically. The United States' efforts here have completely failed.
It's really interesting, Margaret, how you lay this out. On one hand, one narrative is that the Saudis in particular are feuding with Qatar over influence in the region. Who gets to be the one that dominates the sphere of influence in that region? Saudi Arabia accuses people in Qatar of having close ties to supporting Islamic terrorist groups in Iran, for example. On the other hand, you've got the United States that's trying to thread this needle. We've got this significant major base here, but Iran is obviously an adversary of the United States, as President Trump has repeatedly stated. And so what's the truth here? Because it feels like you have Saudi Arabia saying one thing, you have the Qataris saying another, and then you have the U.S. trying to sort of be in the middle as represented by Zinni.
Exactly. And there are disputes within the U.S. government about how to address this, how to settle it. Remember, if you go back to when this dispute bubbled up, there was a divide here because President Trump was saying things completely contradicting his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who was hugely experienced in the region due to his time at ExxonMobil. He had deep relationships in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar, but President Trump stood in the Rose Garden that June and said that Qatar at the very highest levels was funding terrorism. So the president seemed to buy the Saudi line here entirely. That was also, if you recall, very closely tied to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who really helped or is viewed as having led this push to isolate Qatar. And it really hasn't achieved what he had hoped it would achieve. In fact, it's somewhat backfiring here. And so this led to a rift within the United States government. The solution was supposed to be that the U.S. would step in and settle things, that the professional diplomats, that those with deep relationships, like General Zinni, could step up and take control of something that the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who doesn't have deep diplomatic experience, had been at the center of. Instead, the idea was, let's pull this over to the professionals. And as you hear from General Zinni, he thinks that this is just not going anywhere. Keep in mind, The reason it matters when the president and then Secretary of State say different things is because the United States is supposed to be pushing in the same direction on all fronts to be able to force someone to make concessions. When you see these divisions within the U.S. government, it really weakens our stance, it weakens our influence, and ultimately it added up to no round of negotiations and no success on this diplomatic front, which is what General Zinni has said in his resignation letter.
Margaret, I'm curious about another player that doesn't get often mentioned when it comes to this sort of feud that exists in the Gulf here, and that's Turkey, because there was a thought that when the Saudis cut off all these ties and stopped imports, Qatar relies heavily on imports, that would sort of lead them to the bargaining table. But from what I've been able to read, they do get some essential goods from Turkey and, of course, Iran. We know how the Saudis feel about Iran, but what's Turkey's sort of role in this?
Well, this was one of the things that then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was warning about. Look, if you try to isolate them, you're actually going to push the Qataris towards people we don't want them building alliances with or working with more, like Iran. And as you said, Turkey as well, led by President Erdogan. This has been a really problematic ally of the United States. They're, yes, on paper, NATO allies, but they've really been at cross purposes with the Trump administration and the Obama administration on a number of fronts. So this, in some ways, is backfiring here. Isolating Qatar has not forced the concessions that the Saudis had argued for, and in fact, it's pushed them more towards the Turks and the Iranians. And so that is a problem as well for the Trump administration here.